Well, welcome to another Ritual Woodcraft video, and today we're going to build a bench for 4 people for under $20. I call it a fence picket bench because that's exactly what we're going to use. I built this one about a year ago out of some extra fence pickets I had, 7 of them, and they're about $1.89 a piece, somewhere around there, so even that's under $20. Not counting the screws, of course. And today I have some materials left over from a fence repair that I did for a house nearby. And I have about 6 pickets. Now this old bench has been out in the weather for about a year, and I did shellac it a bit, but it weathered really nicely. It took some sanding because you know how rough cut this fence lumber is, but I've only had to sand it that one time. I built that first bench about as long as I could build it, cutting off only the dog-eared edges of these pickets, and it worked out to be the exact size I needed for that redwood table that I built. So I'm just going to duplicate that bench. We'll use it as a model for measuring as we replicate that bench. So I'm trimming the wood that we will be using. First, the 2 full-size pickets for the top. But we also have these 2 full-size pickets that we use for the bottom shelf. And I'm cutting those to size now. And then I'm going to need to rip a picket for the thinner strip down the middle. And then 17.5 inches plus 5/8 inches for the thickness of the top gets us just the right height. And I can cut 4 of those 17.5 inch pieces out of one picket. And when I rip the pickets for the narrower centerpiece on the top of the bench, it will leave just the right amount of wood remaining for the 2 stretchers along the shelf, as well as for one of the wider aprons that go directly under the bench. The great economy of this bench comes from using these fence pickets that are inexpensive to begin with, and then using them completely. We can build this with about 7 pickets. We will need to rip one more picket for the second apron that goes directly under the seat. So I'm cutting the wood to size simply by measuring the existing bench that we've already built. And of course, the sizes are arbitrary because I just built according to what wood I had. Next, we're going to look into the support structure here because that's the secret of this bench. Now this is the remaining part of that picket that I ripped, and I'll cut it down the middle for the 2 stretchers along either side of the bottom shelf. And find the center, factor in the width of the blade. Here I'm using the mag switch feather board that virtually acts like a third hand, and I can rip this board easily right down the middle. You'll see that I'm using a riving blade because these pickets are wet and it's wonky wood and it's warped, and that's just the kind of wood that can bind the blade. I have 6 pickets, not 7, so I'm going to need some extra wood, and I have a few 2x6 pieces left over from the table build, and I'll be able to utilize those in some of these supports. But 6 to 8 pickets is plenty to build the entire bench. I have some 2x4 left, and I'm going to rip this section right now, right down the middle, and I'm going to use this under the bench top for support and to attach it to the rails and the sides. And the 2x6 pieces remaining from the table build, I'll use right here to transfer the load from the bench top down through the shelf and directly to the ground. The fence system on my table saw is the Incra LS positioner, and it allows me to repeat cuts and to set them very accurately to 1/1000th of an inch. I just dial in the correct number, and even if I move the fence, I can come back to that exact measurement. Again, I'm using the mag switch here to help me as a third hand as I rip these pieces. Now, it took less than an hour. We have all the wood pieces basically cut. We'll need to size some of the bracing and so on, but we're ready to get started. So I'll start with 2 of the 17.5 inch pieces that look like they go together well, and I'll begin working on one end of the bench. Now I'm going to use this split piece of 2x4 to make the cross braces for either end. So I've measured those just to where I want them, and I'll cut them to size here at the miter saw. Now, basically, these two side pieces will just about be touching each other with just a small tiny space in between. And then I'm going to use 1 5/8" construction screws to attach them to the brace. And I'm pre-drilling for a countersink here. I don't want these boards to split this close to the end. So you do have to pre-drill, and you have to be a little bit careful. You know how powerful these drill drivers can be, and you'll take that screw right through the piece of wood and split it right down the middle. So I'm taking a little care. And I am going to pre-drill for most of the attachments I'll make for this bench. Now we're going to reference underneath of the previous bench, and you can see that I used various types of braces for support and attachment. It seems I used whatever wood I had laying around. 1x, fence pickets, 2x. I'm measuring here, I'm 4 3/4 inches up for my shelf wood, and I'm actually going to cut a dado groove just 3/16 of an inch deep, just to give these shelf boards someplace to seat, and we'll hold them snug with some additional bracing later on. And you'll see as we move along in the construction how that happens. I'm going to set a stop here on my cutoff saw, 3/16 of an inch down, and I'll just pull it across this wood and move it from mark to mark in 1/8 inch increments until I get that wood removed where those shelf pickets will seat. You could certainly accomplish this with a router or on the table saw using a dado stack, or just moving it across your normal blade. Whatever works best for you. I'll rough them out here, and I'll clean them up with a chisel to make sure they're going to be a good fit and a nice seat. Now I'll repeat this process, of course, for the other end. And this wood is easy to work with, but as you use your chisel, you want to cut your stops and score the outside edges before you push it through, because it is prone to splitting. So whenever you see me using the chisel, I'll take care to cut all my stops before I start hammering, because this wood breaks easily. It's pretty soft wood. And again, I'm pre-drilling for a countersink for the screws that I'm going to apply, especially this close to an end of a board. But I'm just duplicating what I did previously for this other side of the bench. And then I'll match it up with the one that's already completed, and we'll bring that dado right across, and we'll use the first one to reference as a guide for the second one. You can see this just gives me enough space to seat those pickets into these sides. Now, these aren't really deep enough to hold a piece of wood if it bends, because the length of it will be lost in that bend. But the beauty of this bench is the way it's supported. No matter how many people sit on it, 1, 2, 3, or 4, that weight gets distributed evenly, and these flimsy boards don't bend. It'll support that weight easily. And now I'm taking a little piece of wood, because remember, we're going to recess the stretchers that go along the side. So I'm going to need to trim just the thickness of one of these pickets off of each picket that I'm using for the shelf. And I'm using a piece of wood to set my blade, using the mag switch to hold the board against the fence. And because I got the mag switch there, and these are the same dimension board, I can just run one, drop the next one in, and run it through also. And voila, we're done. Now I'm seating these boards right into the dado groove that we cut in the side supports. I really should have photographed this from the other side. You can't see it, but you can imagine what's going on. It's seated in there. Now I'm eyeballing to drill from the outside right into the center of that piece of wood that's going to make the shelf. And I'll put one screw in to hold it in place. And then I'll make sure the other board is seated well. And we'll continue the process until I have 4 screws, 2 into each shelf board. Now, this is just a simple garden bench, so to speak. It's not rocket science. You can certainly make all these measurements and draw all the necessary lines, whatever is comfortable for you. I'm simply eyeballing it here because it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be sturdy. Granted, this is asking for a mistake, and I absolutely do drill a hole in the wrong place. But again, it's just a garden bench, and I'll just drill another hole and make certain that we have the fastened supports that we need. You could also glue these joints as well. I'd use a waterproof glue like Type Bond 3, but this wood is very wet right now, and it dries out and shrinks quite a bit. I was surprised that the previous bench didn't shrink so much that it actually would split apart. It stayed together well over the course of the year. It probably weighs half as much as this new bench is going to weigh just because the wood is so much drier after a year. Some of these fence pickets are so wet, they're still damp to the touch. Again, I'm using 1 5/8 inch screws here, and that's sufficient to get a nice deep bite into the wood. And right there you can see where I drilled the hole in the wrong place. I simply drilled another beside it so that the screw would have somewhere to seat. And indeed, if I was building a piece of fine furniture, I would certainly be measuring twice and being very careful where I placed every hole, every cut, every screw would be checked and rechecked. Next, we're going to place the 2 stretchers across the bottom shelf. I'm going to chisel away the wood on these sides to fit these stretchers, so I'm marking them carefully, and it's about 1/4 inch into the wood, a little less. Now you can see the bow in that piece of wood. It can't even hold itself straight, and I'm not getting a true measurement from side to side, so I'm going to slip a piece of wood under there to straighten it out, and I'll remark this end. Now I'm going to pare away at the wood around that dado groove, just down into the shelf wood so that these stretchers will fit nice and snug into each side, and then we'll screw them into the shelves to pull those sections together. As all these pieces come together, the shelf riding in the dado that we cut or supported by the screws that attach them, they start to share the load of each individual board among themselves. And that's what makes this flimsy wood work in a bench design like this. All the parts work together for the integrity of the whole. Now be careful again when you're using the chisel. As I said, cut all your stops and use the mallet lightly because this wood will split very easily. I'm only going to attach these stretchers with 3 screws to begin with, 1 in the middle and 1 on either side. Now I'll come back later when the bench is completely assembled, and I'll add more screws and fasteners wherever they're needed along the top and along these aprons as I see fit. But I make it a practice to use a minimal amount while I'm putting something together, because if I make a mistake and have to take it apart to correct that mistake, a little less screws, the less attachments, the better. Now these 2 pieces will help keep the bottom shelf in place against the sides, keep it from moving so that the dado cuts can add their support. Now these sides are screwed into the shelves themselves. That's the initial 4 screws. And these other 4 holes that I'm drilling now are into the supports underneath the shelf. Those 2 small pieces of fence picket wood underneath the shelf help keep those shelf boards in place against the sides. And that gives it all the support it needs. See, here they are. These will give the shelf additional support and keep it in place tightly against the sides, because that 3/16 of an inch dado cut just won't hold on its own. It needs this help. As long as these supports are keeping those shelf pickets in place and secure, then that dado adds integrity to the entire design. Again, all the individual components work together for the integrity of the whole. Okay, now we're going to just drop on the boards that we're using for the top. There's a narrow piece in the middle and then 2 full width pickets on either side. And I'll space those evenly. Again, I'm measuring the old bench to get an idea, but I'll basically just center them lengthwise and widthwise on the bench. And then I'm pre-drilling for a countersink screw hole right into the support that holds those 2 side pieces together. You know, that 2 by 2 1/4 inch thick piece. That gives me a nice broad, thick base to drive these screws into and secure the top to the sides. Again, you could measure all this out and make sure everything is spaced evenly, but for my purposes, I'm just doing this all by eye. It'll be close enough, and it'll be structurally sound, and it is just a garden bench. Now I'm going to attach the 2 aprons. We're right up to the edge of the wood. We're going to attach the first screw into the larger piece that is the brace and support, and then the next screw right into the side, and that's just a little bit more than 1/2 inch thick. Now it looks like a bench, but it certainly is way too flimsy to use, whereas this one is nice and sturdy and strong. And the secret are these center supports that don't allow the wood to bend and bow. The strength comes right from the ground up through these supports into the seat. And so I'm referencing the old bench to approximate where I'll put these supports in the new bench. And again, this is not rocket science. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. I do want them to look similar. And I'm dividing the space up under this bench top and between the shelf and the top into thirds, just to give even distribution. These 2 center supports are just 2x6s, and they've been milled down to about 5.5 inches wide, so they certainly don't go all the way across. But they attach in the middle, centered under the top and on the shelf. And I'm driving screws right through the seat pickets into those 2x6s. And then I'll come right through the bottom of the shelf into those 2x6s. I'm going to use a speed square to make certain everything is straight and square. And I won't even need to pre-drill these holes because I'm going through the center of the picket wood and right into the broader 2x6 redwood. Now I'm making sure they're straight and square, and then I'm fastening them with these 1 5/8 inch construction screws. I just put 2 in each right now because we're going to add more supports. Now I'll move it to the bench so it's easier to work on, and you can see now I'm adding bracing under the seat. Again, it's from that 2x4 that I ripped in halves. And I'm attaching these aprons to those braces underneath the seat with the 1 5/8 inch construction screws. And I'm using 2.5 inch screws to go through the 2x that are vertical into these 2x that are the supports under the bench. Taking 1 screw in from one side and 1 screw in from the other side, and I'm just using 2. It'll be plenty of support, and you can see that I've used 2 5/8 screws through the side stretchers or aprons into those 2x that are the supports. So everything is well secured. The last step will be to add the 2x under the shelf, which will transfer the load from the shelf directly to the ground and keep either the shelf or the bench seat from bending. And the way these are going to go, I've measured so that they'll be the same length from the bottom of the shelf to the ground as the sides. And I'm taking 2.5 inch self-drilling screws, and I'm going through the fence picket wood at an angle right into the 2x that are the vertical supports on top of the shelf. And then I'm taking 2 more 2.5 inch screws, going on an angle right through this 2x into the fence picket wood that is the support on the other side. Now everything is evenly supported and well supported. It shares the load much like a bridge, where all the vertical supports and horizontal structure work together to make it safe and sound. And you can see my 200 pounds doesn't bow any part of this wood, even when I stand on it. It's a little wobbly because the slab is broken and uneven here, but it's strong and secure. I have a lot of sanding that I'll need to do. I'll need to go over the entire bench. But for now, it fits well with the table I've made. It looks like the previous bench that's a year old. It has storage space underneath, and now it's done. Thank you for watching. Every time I build something, even this simple, I learn something. And we did this for under 20 bucks. Please watch some of my other videos and subscribe if you think my content is helpful.